We started the week here in the Energy Security and Climate Change program at CSIS with a discussion of the 2025 Energy Institute Statistical Review of World Energy. This is a benchmark product that tells us how energy is produced, how it's consumed, and how it flows around the world. Today, Kevin and I are going to take a look at some analysis of our own, leveraging this data set, which is freely available to users around the world, and talk about some of the implications we've been thinking about over the past week. Kevin, good morning.
Good morning. It's a wonderful resource, isn't it?
It is. This is a thing that sits on the desk of every energy analyst, hopefully.
Yes.
And sometimes now in PDF form rather than in book form. But it provides a really interesting picture of what is actually happening in energy. And as much as we talk about the future of energy, it's sometimes useful to look at the recent past to really understand where we are.
And to have a common data set to work from that happens to have the virtue of being free, which is always well appreciated by a lot of those analysts you mentioned.
So the report was released in June. We had a discussion on Monday, which we can link for viewers of this session. But Kevin, you've done some of your own early analysis leveraging this data set. Why don't we start with what you have looked at primarily over the week?
Sure. We wait excitedly for this report every year. Last year it was wonderful to moderate the session and to talk about it. And this year there was essentially a change that I want to talk about in a minute to this very statistic. The statistic shows the share of the energy mix from different fuels in total energy supply, which you'll find early in the tab sequence in the spreadsheet. The blue area is fossil fuels. And going over a 35-year horizon, so the long view, which I think is very important when we talk about transition, when we talk about the geological underpinnings of climate policy, we're going from essentially 90% fossil fuels as a source of energy supply to 87%, which is not a very big change. And you might say, well, okay, as a percentage of the mix, that's about the same, but what about in absolute levels? And it turns out that those fossil fuels increase 70% over the interval, so about a 1.6% compound annual growth rate, which is pretty significant also. What you can't see within the mix, these blue bars here, decompose, of course, into oil, natural gas, and coal. Coal is about 28% of the mix from the start to the end, although it goes up and down a little along the way. Natural gas, 21% up to 25%. Oil down 41% to 34%. So actually a fairly significant mix shift for oil, which reflects, among other things, the rapid growth of biofuels. Now, there's a couple things you can't see in the numbers besides that. One of them is that do you remember last year when we did the session, do you remember what the percentage of fossil fuels was in the energy mix?
I believe it was in the low 80%, but I don't know if it was 81 or 82.
About 81%, a great memory, yeah. So what happened? Did we go up 6 percentage points in fossil fuels in the course of 1 year? That would sound like an incredible change in transition.
Right. Well, I don't know, did nuclear plants close?
No.
Did we have a dry season at a big hydroelectric dam?
Gosh, well, there have been some drought issues for hydro, but actually we're looking at renewables, non-hydro renewables at 3% of the mix, nuclear at 5%. I don't think you're going to find a lot of deltas that are to get you to 6 or 7 percentage points.
Did we change the way we do the math?
Oh, we changed the way we did the math, and not just here, also in the Annual Energy Outlook at the EIA. And the difference is not just in terms of the share of the mix, but how you count that share. Right? And it's very important because this is where energy numbers, all the time we look at these numbers, we take them very seriously, but we have to realize that data decisions, data quality are very limited when it comes to energy. It's very hard to count all this stuff.
Right.
You have to make a lot of decisions along the way. One of the decisions that was made in recent years was to stop counting renewables, non-hydro renewables, non-combustion, non-hydro renewables. So essentially wind and solar are the big increments here.
Right.
To stop counting them in terms of the energy content of the fossil fuels they replace, and to start counting them in terms of the actual heat content of the electricity that they deliver.
Right.
And that delivered energy basis, that effective changes everything, it turns out. It changes the way it looks in the mix. There's your 6 percentage points.
Now, do you have a strong view on whether or not there is a qualitative difference in the role that renewables are playing or the diversification of the energy system? Or is this mostly a quantitative difference and something that accountants are interested in, but the big storyline remains the same?
Well, you have to backwards adjust your
Yeah.
statistic when you change your statistical methodology, or you'll get discontinuities
Of course.
that make no sense.
Right.
But actually, how you count, as long as it's internally consistent, shouldn't matter. It does, however, have an impact when it comes to forward projections.
Yes.
So in the AEO, what the EIA did when they projected forward is they were projecting a significant increase in renewables as a share of the mix, as most statistical outlooks do. But when you have such a big part being made up by renewables, and now renewables are skinnier per unit of megawatt hour or what other delivered unit of energy you're talking about,
Right.
then you end up with a different shape of the curve. And that actually led in the EIA's AEO to demand going down before it went up instead of going up before it went up, which is a very different outlook. So it does
Yes.
make a difference. It's not just an accounting thing. It creates a sense what the overall picture of supply-demand balances looks like.
And when you think about just the big storyline, this 30-year storyline, as much as we read headlines of the dramatic increase in the pace of build out for wind and solar and renewables, in a lot of that's in China, which we can talk about in a second. You also see over the past 30 years increases in fossil fuel consumption on net in almost every year. What are the exceptions?
Well, there's 2009 and 2020 when there was a bit of a downtick in global economic circumstance, and the linkage between fossil fuel consumption, energy consumption, and GDP is very, very tight.
Right.
And so, unsurprisingly, when we had the greatest economic reversal in 7 decades, when we had the greatest pandemic in a century, these events compressed demand.
And one of the things we heard about on Monday was that the global picture that emerges from the data is one of a disorganized transition. I think I look at this data and I go, what transition?
Yes. I think transition is an interesting way to describe what's going on.
Yeah.
What you see is a supplementation, not a substitution. And that's fine. What it says, though, is that we have a growing energy demand that is being supplied by new sources that are coming on stream. There are very few places in the world where we've actually seen substitution of incumbent sources with a significant climate impact. The U.S. being one of them, where, of course, we have the most significant replacement of coal with natural gas, but also some substitution, some biofuel substitution for petroleum, some substitution. But it's very hard to get substitution in a growing world. What you get is supplementation.
Exactly. Maybe we can turn to that because one of the things I've looked at over the past week is instead of thinking about, and this came out of our conversation on Monday, instead of thinking about the challenge in terms of absolute emissions, where you're in this world of energy addition. So last year, in 2024, every energy source was utilized at record levels, and that means fossil fuel emissions did go up. But one of the things we talked about in the conversation on Monday was the carbon intensity of energy production. Now, this is, as you know, something I'm very interested in, and something I think we're interested in increasingly in Washington, because as you look at the nature of US and Chinese competition, one of the things that is emerging when we think about setting a strategy for climate is should we focus instead of on absolute emissions, carbon intensity?
Intensity of what?
So this is the carbon intensity of production.
Okay.
So Vice President Vance in a debate last year with Tim Walz said, hey, if you're concerned about climate, one of the best things you can do is bring manufacturing back to the United States because the Chinese grid is coal heavy, it's emissions heavy, they use a lot of polluting resources there. Here, because of the natural gas story, we've got a much cleaner grid. And so moving production to the United States is a way of reducing global emissions because of the lower carbon intensity. Now, one might quibble with the argument, but we see the same theme come up when we look at things like border adjustment, Senator Cassidy's bill on foreign pollution fees. That's what, the EU is trying to recognize carbon intensity in its CBAM and border adjustment mechanisms. A lot of companies are starting to think about carbon intensity and accounting for their own supply chains and their own products. And as we kind of navigate a growing world, but still try to find a way to manage climate change.
What are we looking at here?
So this comes from the same data set. We are right now, it is true that energy production in China, or energy consumption, is more energy intensive, emissions intensive than the United States. In China, they produce about 83 million tons of CO2 equivalent per exajoule of energy consumed. In the United States, we're at around 60 million tons of CO2. So there's a carbon advantage to the US. Maybe if we consume a little bit more on the margins, we do a little bit better on global emissions.
You are talking about an intensity in terms of energy consumption or production.
Yeah.
The emissions associated with energy output or energy consumed. But a lot of intensity discussions also concern energy or climate intensity or emissions intensity of GDP.
Right.
And that's where we start to get into an interesting question.
Yes.
We did outsource a lot of our heavy industry over the course of the years when our climate or emissions intensity of GDP declined rather dramatically.
Sure.
If we start to bring that home, does that change the story?
So let's think about that a little bit, because if you look at the Chinese utilization of energy, they use a lot more energy for relatively similar GDP that we have here in the United States. So the US economy is more energy efficient in terms of GDP. It is more, or in terms of GDP, it is then more carbon efficient in terms of energy consumption. Those two.
So by transition, if we're using less energy per unit of GDP and each unit of energy is cleaner, we must be cleaner in terms of energy, climate intensity of GDP.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, how durable is that lead? This is my question.
Yeah.
Because you read about China, they're building they consumed in this data set 10 more exajoules of coal energy from 2015 to 2024. They also built a ton of hydro. They built a bunch of nuclear. They're building increasingly more renewables. So I wanted to understand, well, what does this mean for the relative carbon intensity or the change in carbon intensity of our two economies over that period? Because we might be ahead, but there may be a tortoise and hare situation here. Where carbon intensity as a long-term strategic imperative, should it become one, we need to find ways to.
Do you think we don't have an entrenched advantage that just stays static and keeps us in the lead forever?
I don't think so. So we look at the data and we try and find out. This shows us from 2015 to 2024, the change in carbon intensity, China and the United States. In the United States, we fell at 0.5 million tons of CO2 per exajoule of emissions per year. Apologies for the units, but the fall in China was nearly twice what we had here in the United States, which means that as China is diversifying its energy supply, building lots of renewables, over this time period, built a lot of hydro, that the CO2 intensity of energy did fall faster than the United States. And this is the period where we are realizing gains from natural gas displacing coal in our own energy production. And transportation emissions have remained relatively static over that time period.
You're telling me, if I got this straight, and those online, if I have it wrong, correct me, a country that is putting in so much hydro that they change the rotation of the Earth, it's doing triple-digit gigawatts of clean energy installation on an annual basis, has probably going to close that gap.
Right, and I think this is an important thing for policymakers, because as we are considering things like carbon border adjustments or foreign pollution fees, carbon tariffs, predicated on the US having a carbon advantage, this is a way to make trade a little bit more fair in the minds of some policymakers. We want to know not just today's advantage, but where it may be going. And so this creates a challenging picture for a lasting US carbon advantage without some strategy to see ours fall as well. That's what I think we see in the data. Now, the important thing, the second calculation you can do is say, all right, I've got a difference, I've got a rate of change that's faster in one place than the other. When does China catch up to the United States? Were these trends to continue?
Yes.
I find the lead is pretty durable until 2080.
2080?
Yes.
Well, we'll be continuing this discussion for some time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a linear extrapolation. It's not probably the right way to make the comparison, but it does tell us that the US carbon advantage appeals relatively durable. And I think that has real implications for how our policymakers should be thinking about these mechanisms.
There are some people who think that the current president, who seems to enjoy using tariffs as a tool of geostrategy, might be amenable to a tariff based on this principle, which, this is kind of an interesting week to have this discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, given that we were raising tariffs for all sorts of reasons, court cases in some countries,
interesting,
economic activity in another, we might find ourselves, I don't think immediately, but in the next few years, thinking about carbon-based trade mechanisms as a longer term and more, I think probably more durable policy mechanism.
Well, do we have another slide that brings us to that discussion?
We sure do.
Interesting. Seems like we worked this out somehow. Don't think it's a rigged game. No, this is entirely spontaneous. Okay, so what we have here is a chart with a divergent trend series, which I think if you keep going with us week after week or biweekly after biweekly, you'll see that I love those. I love it when they scissor apart. And you have the S&P 500 performance relative to Liberation Day, April 2nd, when President Trump unveiled his reciprocal and global tariffs.
That's green.
That is green on the top. And you have on the bottom, you have the Brent crude closing price relative to that same baseline. So they're common sized. And what you can see is that one is up by 11.5 points in the market, and crude is down 7.5 points. And you have to say, well, clearly the world is different for people who are trading energy and people who are trading stocks. And that's often true, although if you look at these two series, over the 10 years through Liberation Day, they correlate at about a 0.63 correlation coefficient, so they're modestly, meaningfully correlated. Of course, they break apart a lot. I think it would be a mistake to assume is there ever only one thing going on in the oil market? Is that just one thing at a time? So there were a few things. This peak we talked about last time, of course, the trough. A lot of that has to do with OPEC Plus adding back supply, supersized additions, headline additions. We see that there was a lot of Saudi supply added to the market in the last month, particularly, I think, trying to get some out of the Strait of Hormuz before things got rough. But there may be another dynamic at work here too, which is you have a very tech-forward S&P 500 right now, and energy represents a tiny slice of that overall index. And so there's a lot of expansion going on as the land grab in AI and everything else, which has energy implications, starts to drive that index upward.
Right.
You also have demand concerns that may show up in the oil patch that the stock market is just shrugging off. Show me the data, they say. We don't see it, we don't care. But if you think about what these tariff headwinds could mean to the organic economic demand that drives energy demand, I think there are some traders who are saying we're seeing demand slackening. The IEA's report came out and said, look, we're seeing demand slowing down still, even after the last report, yet another decline in projected oil demand for the year. And so I think that possibly some of this tariff friction may have an energy impact that we also want to think about.
And if we get our signs correct, we have tariff friction, which could reduce the economic forecast, and we have increases in supply coming online from OPEC Plus, which portends, we make not a prediction, but those two would directionally point us toward lower prices over time?
Well, all other things being equal, that's
yeah.
on the demand side and the supply side. If you see both of those forces moving at once, you would get that. But we do have a volatile world.
Right.
We're living in a world where the global order is repartitioning, reshuffling. Some of the stability and prosperity that we've known our entire lives may look a little different, perhaps a topic for another time.
Well, I look forward to joining you at our next session. Kevin, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thanks for having me, Joseph.
Colleagues, thank you for joining us, and I hope you're enjoying these short data expositions. Do let us know what you think. Your comments and suggestions are welcome, and we'll see you next time here at CSIS.